Right, so with us today is David Herford, the Secretary of the BC Craft Farmers Co-op. David, thank you for joining us today.
Great to be here, Jim. Nice to talk with you.
Yeah, so we've got a lot of people stateside. We also have a lot of people on the Canadian side of the cannabis industry. So for people that don't know you, your co-op, kind of give us the 30,000-foot look or the explanation, and then we'll go ahead and build from there and have a conversation about the industry and everything else that comes along with it.
Yeah, great. Well, we're in Vancouver, BC, so greetings to everybody. The co-op is, just that. We have a certain business model in Canada, at least, and in British Columbia for co-ops. Co-ops generally are a hybrid between a business and a nonprofit, I guess. So they, in BC anyway, they have their own unique category, their own legislation, and so on. So I think it gives you the best of both worlds. It's entrepreneurial, but what it does is collect independent businesses and allows them who have common cause. Co-ops have been quite common in agricultural sector for decades and generations, and in other areas as well. Housing, you see co-ops quite regularly in other areas. But essentially the goal is to give the small guy or woman some of the benefits that larger companies have around economies of scale. So it allows you to essentially pool your collective resources. You pool your political clout in a highly regulated industry. You need to make sure that you have a conversation with the regulator and make sure that there's good dialogue there and that the rules make sense. You want to pool your purchasing power so that you can drive down the costs of everything that you buy, everything from insurance to accounting services to soil and lights. And then, of course, to pool your marketing strength to make sure that there is a market for your product and that the farmers are being treated fairly when it comes time to distributing that product and getting it to consumers in the most effective way possible. So that's generally what co-ops do, is it's really strength in numbers. And I think in cannabis, particularly in Canada, but I think this is the case around the world, as countries start to legalize, you start to see concentrations of large corporate entities, perhaps starting to get some, less choice for consumers as a result of that, fewer players in the market, which is not good for anybody. I don't think it's frankly good for the large players either in the end. And so I think that's part of the effort here as well. We thought this co-op model was particularly conducive to the situation that small cannabis farmers found themselves in British Columbia. It's unique to be in British Columbia because we have the reputation for having the best cannabis farmers in the world. BC Bud is not used as much here, but certainly used around the world. It's sought after, much like certain brands of wine or champagne might be sought after, or Napa Valley or various areas like that. There's something unique about the land, and there's something unique about the people who are growing it. So I think in British Columbia, it's nothing against small craft farmers anywhere else. Generally, I think most people would prefer to get their cannabis from local small farmers as opposed to large, multiple football field size corporate operations. So I think that there is some effort there within Canada anyway to try and get some leveling of the market to make sure that consumers have more choice, and that these small farmers, particularly the ones in BC that have been advocates, are the ones who've been fighting for legalization. It would be a shame to have them lead the fight, and then when you get there, they're left out. So I think there's a part of completing the circle, so to speak. We haven't legalized all the way yet. What we did do in Canada is we legalized everyone's possession, their ability to possess cannabis, but we didn't legalize their supply. And I think that traditionally, when you look at the medical history in Canada, the courts have constantly told governments that you can't do one without the other. You can't make it legal to possess and then put people in a position where they're creating a second illegal act in terms of requiring you to have a product that's legal. So there's some unfinished necessary things to do with not transitioning these small farmers into the game as they have the product that everybody wants. So we think there's a significant public interest in terms of making sure that the policy in Canada of legalization works. And that means getting rid of the illicit market. That means having that diversity between small and large. And now I think in the pandemic, it means creating jobs and economic growth. These farmers are creating employment in their local communities, especially in British Columbia, where we have a global demand for our products. I think during the pandemic now, it makes complete sense to really put the foot on the gas of accelerating these craft cannabis farmers into the legal market, because they will create a lot of direct jobs and spin-off jobs, including a lot of work for financial services, accountants, and so on and so forth. Our goal is to create 2,000 craft farmers in BC in the next 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, there's 20.
Yes, at
That have been
23, I
approved.
saw on your site or something like that. In the past, like 2 years, they've approved.
Only 20 have been approved. Now we know there are thousands and thousands. We know there's 6,500 in BC alone that are approved to grow for medical patients. These are the expert farmers that we want to transition into the legal market. So even if we transitioned a third of them, that's 2,000 farmers, and they each create 2.5 direct jobs each.
Mm-hmm.
That's 4,500 jobs. And then the spin-off jobs are 2, 3 to 1, and those include accountants and the people who are going to be helping these small businesses with all of the issues that every small business needs. So we need accountants and financial professionals certainly to be part of that solution, and the co-op is there to try and bring all of those people together.
Thank you for explaining that. The difference between the legalization of possession and not having the supply chain, because I saw on the website, yes, 6,500 growers, 23 have been approved, so very, very few. Help me to better understand, do you need to be asked by the government to transition from medical to rec, or how do you become one of these 23 approved? It seems like a very coveted position. What was special about those 23 people or 23 groups compared to the 6,500 other ones?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think that, first of all, when you look at the BC ones, most of the ones that are approved are outdoor in their own land. So the cost for them in terms of compliance was a lot lower, probably, $15,000 to $20,000 to get yourself up to speed. Ultimately, outdoor growing is the way to go. It's really been forced underground by, the prohibition. In BC, we would picture fields of cannabis growing just like you would drive by an orchard and see peach trees or wineries and so on and so forth. It should be that normal. So I think the ones that are getting approved generally seem to be the outdoor ones because of the low cost barrier for those people. Still a high regulatory burden. The fact that we've only had 20 some, maybe of those of 25, maybe 15 are outdoor growers. The fact that we haven't had more of them. There's more than 15 people doing outdoor growing in BC. Tells you that the regulatory red tape is very complex. Government programs at the best of times are, they require a certain level of rigor and review. Myself, I've been involved in public affairs working in Canada at all three levels of government for about 25 years. And, when you design a program to meet a group of people, you want it to succeed. And the way you make it succeed is you actually involve them in the development of the program.
Mm-hmm.
They are the experts in many cases, and you need to understand their needs if you're going to be effective. It doesn't matter what government agency you're working in. If you're not talking to your stakeholders, and one of the reasons the medical program in Canada has been effective for some 25 years is because when it was developed, the compassion clubs of the day, the people who were growing, were actually involved in the development of the program. That didn't happen in Canada this time. It was really developed without the small farmers' input, without the input of the experts, and as a result, you've got a red tape nightmare that's out of touch. Almost seems to be built to fail.
Yeah.
Requires about, if you're an indoor or doing something that's not outdoor, you need about 250 to $1 million to get your small farm ready to meet all of the various conditions, and that's just to be eligible to apply. So to your question, you don't wait for the government. The government has an application process. You go and you fill out all the forms and you try and make sense of it.
Yeah.
And in Canada, it's usually required hiring a lot of experts to interpret these documents for you. Again, these are people that have been growing cannabis for generations, being told how to grow cannabis by people who've never grown cannabis. It doesn't make sense. So you can understand that it's a little daunting. And then the banks, of course, are not making capital available to them because of stigma. There's still a lot of stigma in the system. There's stigma, particularly within public health officials, and in Canada, Health Canada is the one that's responsible for regulating the program. They're not usually in the business of promoting business. So whether they're the right department to hold the keys to the economic benefits of the sector, they don't really see it as their mandate. So the federal government has passed the law, but they haven't provided a lot of leadership in terms of making sure that it's been successful. And I think that they'll have to get more involved. The last thing I'd say too is they've also given municipal, local governments essentially a veto over your plan. So if you're a small grower and you can't get your local municipal or county to approve of your building plans, you're out of luck. And and if you're a retail store, same thing. So if you can't get the local municipality on side, you really don't have much of a chance. And of course, those folks are very much influenced by local law enforcement authorities. And those tend to be also a group of people that is still a little bit, catching up to the fact that cannabis isn't really illegal anymore, that it is an agricultural product. It's there to help create jobs. In fact, probably has more medical benefits than it does harms. We're not seeing, trolleys of people showing up in emergency rooms, driving cannabis impaired on the streets. We've been legal here in Canada. It'll be 2 years next week. And our society's not fallen apart. In a sense, the opposite is true. During the pandemic, cannabis retail stores have become essential services by the government. So they've gone from being illegal to essential in a matter of 24 months.
100%. And you bring up a good point that I think a lot of the stateside viewers don't understand. Like when we hear Canada has legalized cannabis, we think it's a free for all and everyone's opening up a store and everyone's opening up a grow. Like it's very easy to get into this industry. And it seems that it has just as much, if not more, red tape for anybody that wants to participate in the industry, specifically the local municipality where they can kind of veto you opening up. And that's there's a lawsuit in California going on right now where they have delivery services where if you are licensed in one city, you can deliver to the entire state. But the municipality, I think it's like 66% of municipalities have stopped commercial cannabis activity, essentially creating these cannabis deserts. And it's not fair to the patients or to anybody that wants to have that. So it's refreshing and it's sad at the same time to hear that, hey, just because it becomes legal, it doesn't make it that much easier. It may even make it more difficult to get into the industry because of the 3 levels of government, and they're all going to have their own little or big roadblocks essentially that tie you up for a long time. We're 24 months in, you say, and very few people are actually participating in this industry. You hear about the conglomerates, the canopies, the acreage, and things of that nature, but that's not indicative to the real boots on the ground industry that you have purview to, looking and working with these craft farmers here, people that, like you said, they were the beginning of this industry. BC Bud, or being in Michigan a long time ago, seeing French Ziploc bags coming through and is like, exactly where that stuff comes from. So, kudos to the people that out there that helped move this, but hopefully we can get some of those regulations changing. Now, looking forward, are there any kind of talks about specific regulations paring down? Has any province out there or any city, even like the champion, say, hey, anybody that comes can be a part of this? We're talking about British Columbia specifically, but in the Canada overall, is there any one place that's kind of championing the cannabis industry? Like, for example, Oklahoma, it's unlimited licensing, as many as you want, as much as you want, and it's very, very cheap. Is there anything like that in Canada?
Not yet. No, it's still, I think, still in that early stages. In Canada, we're very polite. We kind of listen to things, and we don't really often act that quickly. We'll take a more thoughtful kind of approach. Not to say you don't do that in the States, but it's a little more bureaucratic. Plus, we have a really interesting system of healthcare in Canada, and marijuana is still being treated as a healthcare file in that sense, when really what we needed to be treated at is much more of an agricultural commodity. So I think part of it is patience is required to really get the government decision makers to catch up where everybody else is. You know, the government has been 5-6 years behind public opinion on, I think, generally drug legalization, period, but particularly cannabis. In Canada, the public has been ready for legalization for a long time. And to go back to your scenarios earlier, what would happen in those cases is people would just turn to the quote illegal market and just get the products that they need, and the taxpayers don't benefit from that. And when you look at how it's regulated compared to other products that truly are harmful, let's just use alcohol, which we know kills way, you know, again, I don't know if you can point to a single cannabis related death
I don't think so.
anywhere in North America anyway, considering its prevalence of use. It's been used medically now for decades with medical supervision. If there were adverse health impacts, we would know about it by
By
now.
now,
Believe
yeah.
the public health establishment is just looking for ways. In fact, if anything, we've seen the opposite. But if you take the retail store in Vancouver who is selling cannabis and you look at the paperwork that they have to complete to get a license, it would stack up, Jim, I don't know how tall you are, but next to that brick wall of yours, it probably would go up to your neck.
Oh boy.
If you're selling booze and alcohol, much more of a safety risk. It might come up to your knees if you're lucky.
Wow.
And the cannabis retailer in Vancouver pays $30,000 a year for their business license. Unheard of. What does the booze retailer pay? Maybe $1,200.
Wow.
So none of it is really based on any kind of evidence, which is something I think that we try to pride ourselves on, certainly in Canada, is that we make decisions not based on, you know, who can make their voice the loudest.
Mm-hmm.
We make decisions based on sober evidence, the facts. And here we have, let's just take, we could add tobacco in there too if you wanted to.
Yeah.
What is really harmful? And I think a lot of these things are still written in the era of reefer madness in terms of the overregulation. I'll give you one quick example of the overregulation in the context of the pandemic that we're in right now. And Health Canada, of course, is our regulatory agency. They're responsible for regulating cannabis farmers, and they're responsible for managing the pandemic.
Oh, very different.
So, yeah, so, you know, I hope they're spending more time managing the pandemic.
Yes.
So this is in July. We're just getting started, and we invited one of our farmers to come and speak to a conference that we were having. They had gotten through the system. They were one of the 25. And we wanted her to speak to kind of her experience and mentor others. And she says, I'm just too exhausted. I've just had Health Canada come in and inspect my farm for the past 5 days.
Wow.
And I'm going, 5 days? You meant 5 hours, right? No, 5 days they've been here. Now, this is Salt Spring Island. It's in the middle of nowhere, beautiful spot in BC. I know people who work in the healthcare sector, for example, during the pandemic, who operate nursing homes for seniors. You know, obviously a much more significantly important area than the cannabis farm in Salt Spring Island. How long do you think their inspections take?
Probably
5 hours.
Yeah.
5 hours.
Yeah. Half a day.
What is Health Canada doing? Spending 5 days inspecting a 2,100 square foot farm in the middle of nowhere in BC. You know, to put that in context as to how small that farm is, I know it's hockey, so you guys might not be as up on hockey now. You're in Detroit, so you have a long history of hockey. But, you know, in hockey, there's a neutral zone in between the two blue lines, and it's a fairly small space. 2,100 square feet is half of that neutral zone, so it's very small, very small. How do you spend 5 days inspecting that? So that's just, to me, a good example of just red tape gone wild for a product that really, I think you could say, creates virtually no harm to
100%.
society.
Perfect. So let's talk about the co-op a little bit. It's run by the members for the members, essentially, to help, again, pool their resources and things of that nature. Is it only open to cultivators? Are you taking on people that are vendors? Are there verticals that can join into this, into the co-op here? Let's kind of talk about the composition of your group and kind of who's involved in it.
Yeah. Well, we have a constitution, what we call the rules, which is required in the law here that lays all of that out. And one of the key things is defining membership. So who are the members? The members are really, I'd say, four categories of people. The first are micro farmers, small farmers. So we define that by the federal regulations, which is either less than 2,100 square feet or they're already approved as a medical farmer in the system. So that's where the 6,500 small farmers comes from. So they have approval, they have a license from the government to grow cannabis. It's just limited to the medical area. And we've also opened it up to anyone who wants to apply. So people wanting to get into the system, if you're an applicant, you can become a member. So that's the producers. We also have a category for processors because the farmers, grow the plant, and then when the plant is pulled out of the ground, they hand it to somebody else to get it ready for sale. Sometimes they do that themselves, but micros are allowed to do that themselves. So there's a network of processors, of course, that need to take the product, finish it, package it, test it, get it to market. So there's a category there for processors. And so that's small processors or any BC processor. It could be a large processor, but they've made a commitment to cater to small farmers and give them priority treatment. Third category is retailers. So independent retail stores that want to carry locally grown cannabis from small farmers, or any applicants as well, given that this is still new to include applicants in the process. The fourth category are founding members, which are not unusual for co-ops, the people who essentially get together and set the organization up. So there's a category of founding members. In this case, in BC, there's about 20 of them. So those are the people who get to vote. Those are the main members. But we felt it was important to include other key elements of the craft cannabis family, if you will, to make sure that we're successful. So the two supporter categories is what we called them, because in the co-op, you can't have what's called non-voting members. If you're a member, you get to vote. We wanted to bring those other people in, but we didn't want to give them a vote in the organization. This is clearly an organization built for this group of farmers and processors. They're the vulnerable ones. They're the ones that need the help. So we created two categories of supporters to facilitate participation of key groups, the first of which is vendors. So that's anybody who sells anything to those member groups, whether it's accounting services, as I said earlier, lights, seeds, quality assurance services, whatever it is, anything that any of our members see on their expense sheet, we want them into the co-op. We want them in because we need the critical mass. We want them in because they'll benefit from an expansion of the sector as well. They want to create a market for themselves. They believe in the small business people. Many of them are interested in the cannabis file personally or professionally. So we've done that, and that's been quite successful. So we have a number of accountants, for example, who want to provide financial services, accounting services, bookkeeping for these people who are in a growing area. And so that many of them have joined. And then the other supporter category, which we're just about to add, is the one that's been left out the most, which is consumers.
There you go.
Consumers have the biggest stake really in getting local farmers into the game because they're the ones suffering now with lack of choice. They're kind of just getting what the government is handing them, and 50% of them have opted out of that and are buying still from their local illicit market. So they're voting with their feet, so to speak. So consumers, we feel, can be a big part of the advocacy effort. That's where you get your big numbers. So we're looking at launching with our retail partners. This is something that consumers can do while they're in the store, complaining that there's no local product. We can say, well, here, you want to be part of doing something about it. It really is a movement that you're creating. That's what makes co-op a little bit different than business, is that you're kind of really focused as much in on the public interest. And to be effective, we need to create a little bit of a movement. And so I think that's exciting. People like to join movements, and to unite all of that, the founding members put together a code of conduct, which is a supplement to the constitution of the organization. And it's a one-page kind of pledge, promise of performance, that this is how we're going to treat each other. This is how we're going to treat our approach to the industry. And this is how we're going to treat and behave with the public. So I think that's been a big uniter as well, that we're uniting a movement around ethics, not necessarily greed.
Yeah, 100%. And it's good you've
Which is,
got
I
the
think, something
consumers in
that
there.
people have as well.
That's great. That's great. It's good to kind of see that it's very well organized. There's bylaws, there's a constitution. It's not just like a bunch of people that get together at an Arby's and then talk about things and nothing ever gets done. This is a real organization making big waves in their industry. Because you see some kind of industry groups, they'll be around for 12, 18 months. And then by the end of that 18 months, it's really kind of fizzles out because there's not really the rah, rah, rah. There's not a mission for it. It's not well organized. And it was doomed to fail from the beginning. So it sounds like you said it's a specific type of entity structure in BC or in Canada overall. So that's good to know that there is that kind of structure and rigor to it, that you do have to be choosy about who you bring in. And you do bring in all stakeholders of the conversation. And again, those consumers that need or desire that local product. One of the things you talk about here is that the medical market, right? There's 6,500 medical groups. Do they still produce cannabis for the medical market? Is the medical market larger than the recreational market in Canada? Tell me a little bit about that. What are the consumers voting with? You said half of them are voting with their feet to go to the illicit market. But what about the breakdown of the legal cannabis, so to say? Is it primarily recreational? Is it primarily medical? Half. Talk a little bit about that if you could.
Yeah, it's primarily recreation now. It was entirely medical, of course, as it was in most jurisdictions. And really what that meant is that doctors decided who got to use cannabis and who didn't, which is probably a bit of an unfair burden to put on doctors. But that was essentially the effect of the medical system. We allowed doctors to decide who was above the law and who wasn't, based on need. And many of them weren't trained, frankly, to understand the effects of cannabis. They were being a good doctor and listening to their patients. So I think we have to fight to keep that medical program alive, because a number of the recreation regulations, especially around edible products, for example, are really restrictive. So the maximum dosage, for example, of an edible product in Canada, I think is 10 milligrams. A lot of people who might have been using non-smokable products to help them with their cancer were maybe using 300 milligrams.
Yeah.
So they would literally have to go and buy 30 packages in the legal market to get what they need. So I think that there's a case to be made, and I think that the government has to be careful, because the medical access in Canada is guaranteed by the courts. The Supreme Court of Canada has ruled that the government must guarantee medical access to cannabis. Extraordinary ruling, and they've been tested a couple times. So I think the government will try to withdraw medical access at their peril. I think the future of medical access will be much more around a designation for CBD products. And I think it'll come out of the research that we talked about earlier, where I think you'll see cannabis actually prescribed and made available as alternative treatments, under insurance plans, or the same way that you look at tobacco nowadays. People used to have to go buy the patch and buy the Nicorette gum. Now a lot of health plans just give that to you because it's proven to be an effective alternative. So I think with the research will come, I think, more integration of cannabis in the medical system. In terms of numbers, in Canada, the medical growers are restricted in terms of where their cannabis can go. So they're attached to a patient.
Gotcha.
So if you get a medical license in Canada, let's say, Jim, I've unlucky condition, I've got, a health condition, but I do have a permit to possess cannabis and grow it. I just can't. Physically, I can't. I don't know how, but you do. So I could designate you to be my grower.
Gotcha.
And you would be able to grow enough cannabis. Your yield would be connected to my daily dosage. So and I would be allowed to possess 3-4 months supply. So you'd be able to get to grow enough cannabis that I could be supplied for 4 or 5 months. That's quite a bit of weed.
Yeah.
And then, Jim, you could also grow for 2 other people.
Gotcha.
We've got a perverse system that allows virtually very limited regulatory requirements for medical users, but a huge hoops to jump through just for recreational adult use. So that doesn't make a lot of sense. So what we want to do is keep those people growing medically, but then allow them to get a second license to apply their skills to grow into the recreation market, knowing that the cap is quite low. We want the cap to be doubled from 2,100 square feet so they could grow for the whole neutral zone of the hockey rink, which luckily works out to 4,200 square feet, which is a nice number for us, but still a very small space. So our thinking would be is that in many cases, they would have their medical grow. If they wish to continue to do that, they should, because we want to keep medical supply, but that their recreation grow might be at another location, which would be the equivalent of them commuting to work.
Yeah, or they could do suite A, suite B. It could be something next to it.
Absolutely.
You know, yeah, that kind of thing.
And then where they're growing is maybe a little bit out of town in a big, huge clearing where there's a whole pool of farmers.
Yeah, then you got your
They're
stuff is
all
right
growing
there.
their 5,000 square feet together. And
Mm.
so what you get now is, again, a very local economy of scale out of town, away from, you don't need to be growing cannabis downtown, a bit like an industrial park you would see.
Yeah.
And now you have a bit of a green zone, which will in non-COVID area become a tourist attraction, I'm sure, for people to go out to the farm and literally buy their cannabis straight from the farm.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, where we would want to be, similar to a farmer's market. Very buy local, support local farmers. And I think in the aftermath of the pandemic, local food supplies, relying on your own community instead of the big
Food
government,
yeah.
is what's going to get us by. And I think people are just in the mood to support local economies, support local agriculture. So I think, and co-op is a very safe model for people. They're used to it already. People who, especially an older generation of people who maybe aren't as comfortable with cannabis, when they hear it's a co-op, they go, oh, co-ops are nice. They're safe.
Yeah.
I'm familiar with them. It takes the edge off, and I think appropriately so. So I think that there's a number of things that we're up against, but I think those are some of the major challenges for the medical farmers. Again, as it's a whole new application process for them. It's not as simple as switching. Again, we've given the government some proposals to make that process a lot easier. We would like them to be able to take any extra cannabis, back to my scenario, Jim, if you had some extra cannabis after you grow for your 3 patients, we would like you to not have to destroy it.
Yeah. All
We
that
would
effort
like
and time.
to be able to take that cannabis and put it on the legal market if it can pass all the tests, or transition it to compassion clubs who are trying to make cannabis available for people as a substitute to opiates, the compassion club model, so they could at least take their extra cannabis, divert it into the medical market for people who aren't their designated.
Makes sense.
Let's put it to some good use. Why burn it?
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense to burn it, right?
No, not at all.
It's kind of like, what century are we in here? It's 2021. Let's not burn the extra medical cannabis. Let's actually try and maybe use it for good. So I think it makes sense. So we hope the government could at least agree to that.
For sure, for sure. Well, let's kind of change gears here on some kind of tips. You're got boots on the ground, so these small scale farmers that are trying to get into the industry, they're facing 18-foot walls of paperwork that they likely need to hire a whole entire legal team to get through. So that being the case in this scenario, it may not change for a while, but they still have the passion to get into the industry. What kind of tips do you have for these people? What are the first 1, 2, 3 steps that they should do to kind of get themselves at least acquainted with the industry before they actually go through that regulatory process? Because, hey, maybe in 24 months, the bar is extremely low and the gates open up very wide, but don't want to get caught just starting on day one. You want to start prior to that. What are your tips for those smaller scale farmers, producers, processors, or anybody else that would like to kind of get into that Canadian industry?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I would say is, be prepared to be patient, manage your expectations going in. I think that's key. Kind of know what your ethics are going in. There's a lot of predators in the sector that will try to take advantage of vulnerable people. And I do believe that the farmers are vulnerable. They spent years getting their genetics right, and they're built up a tremendous amount of intellectual property. And I find they dramatically undervalue their own worth in the market. I talked to one farmer who'd been growing all of his life. He grew, great cannabis in huge demand. And we're talking to him about his options in the legal market. And he said, well, I guess I could go and work for a big LP and you make 25 bucks an hour growing. And I went, 25 bucks an hour, you're one of the best cannabis growers in Canada. You should be, if you were going to go work for an LP, you should be making 220 grand a year.
That's what they're doing down here. They're like
To
CTOs down
export
here.
everything that you've built up. It's all in your head. No one has that. The number of people who have this skill is very low. So I think part of it is giving them hope, not false hope, but hope that there's others together. So I think the second piece of advice is pool together, band together, whether it's through a co-op like ours or just local informal groups. You're not alone. I think that's the key thing, is that and it's hard to do this in the COVID world. You would have the meeting at Arby's. That's where it starts. We've had our share of Arby's meetings as well. So it's trust. Very much in the craft sector, I find trust is at the core of it, because these people have been running from the law for so long. They're not sure who to trust.
Yeah.
And as a result, their networks are not that broad in terms of interpersonal dynamics. They've heard of each other, but it wouldn't be unusual to go to a farmer's meeting in a small town in BC and have two people in the room that have been growing cannabis for 20 years, serving a local market, and they've never met each other.
Wow.
So that's the nature of the game, right? They're not competing with each other. They don't see themselves as competitors at all. They just are socially distanced.
They're ghosting. They don't want anyone to know where they are, who they are. They just enjoy their craft.
Absolutely. They don't know, right? They just don't know. So I think, giving them a safe space to come out, find safe spaces, gather with other people like you, find out all the people, look at your balance sheet in a different way. That's kind of what we do, is where are all your expenses? You're complaining about the costs. Have you talked to your vendors about costs? What can you do to bring them in? Go talk to your local governments. Just go have a conversation with them. Be yourself. So I think pool together, empower, be prepared to be patient, set your expectations, try and do whatever you can to maintain your independence and not sell out, because there's a bright future ahead. And others can see that now. You can see many of the cannabis players that have had difficulty, even though the system has been built in Canada for large cannabis companies, many of them are still failing.
Yes, they are. Drawdowns of 90% in their stocks.
Many of them are still failing. And the reasons for that, every story will be different, but they can see the writing on the wall too. I think they understand that it's, especially when they see us organizing and groups organizing and getting out there more. I think, and if the United States or a large market decides to legalize, I noticed your vice presidential candidate talked about full decriminalization of cannabis.
Mm-hmm.
I do believe those large industry players in Canada will not spend a lot of time on a small market of 30 million people. I think they'll move their capital to the United States and maybe producing cannabis in countries to the south as opposed to the north for much cheaper than they can in a very over-regulated system. So I do believe that from a national perspective, to have the cannabis policy work, you need small farmers. Otherwise, your cannabis supply is going to be controlled by foreign entities and that are not even in your country. And I think we don't want that, because then what are people going to do? They're just going to turn back to the illegal market. And, people are going to want their cannabis. They're going to get it somehow.
Yeah.
So I think in Canada, I think people are seeing the writing on the wall, and then you can see these corporate players now kind of finding another way in. So I do fear a lot of buyouts coming. These large companies will try and take over the micro sector, take over that brand, as part of a way to keep their market share. And so that's something we have to be careful about. And the government has to be aware of as well. And I think that we're getting into the world where we have to be careful about anti-competitive practices, making sure that the marketplace is fairly regulated and that these experts have a chance to apply their living. If someone came around and said, Jim, you've been an accountant all your life. We're changing the rules. You can't be an accountant anymore.
That would be no good.
We'll go have to find something else to do, Jim. Sorry. Be a musician, go do something. but we changed the rules. You have to go through our process, and you don't meet the test, so therefore you don't get to be an accountant anymore. You got to find another way to make a living for your family. That's not fair.
No, it's not.
These farmers haven't done anything wrong. In fact, the rest of the country is just caught up to them, and so
Yes.
I think the ultimate sense of fairness and justice as well. So I think that's, and there are remedies for that. I don't want to necessarily go through those kind of remedies in terms of anti-competitive behaviors and consumer protection laws and so on. We'd rather have the government do the right thing and just listen and change the rules. But history of cannabis in Canada, and probably in the States, tells us that the only way you get progress, really, in the end, is elected officials who are ready to stick their neck out,
Yeah.
or the courts who order it to happen. It's usually not led by bureaucracies and officials. It's not led normally by public health officials or police. It's led by the people we elect to make good policy, or the courts who are there to whip the government back in shape when they grow over the line in
Reel
terms
them back
of laws
in.
of the country. So, our hope would be, and that's the way we got here in Canada with cannabis. A lot of people fought in the courts, they won, the governments had to act. We'd rather not go through that again.
No, that's just a painful
The whole
process.
purpose of legalization, it's exhausting, and the government will lose in the end.
Yep. I mean, the facts are against them, and just how long can they hold up this wall? But this wall is built of paper, and it's getting more wet by the day, and it's just going to rip open. At some point, like you said, the writing's on the wall. Cannabis is here to stay. I think Mexico is or has done full legalization for there. They're ramping up production, things of that nature. Kind of, we're making a cannabis sandwich here. Hopefully, the states can kind of come around. It would be great for any
Well,
administration.
California alone is the size of Canada from a population perspective, and for all intents and purposes, it's a jurisdiction that, even in Trump world, is able to thrive with a legal cannabis marketplace with millions and millions and millions of people. So it is only a matter of time, and I think that's why in Canada we need to hurry up and get on the small farmer train. Because I say to some of the folks that when we get a chance to talk to them about policy, is that small farmer in Duncan, British Columbia, small little town on Vancouver Island, she's not going to take her cannabis farm to Mexico to grow cannabis for 50 cents a gram.
Yeah.
She's going to stay in Duncan for the rest of her life. She's going to keep growing cannabis. She's going to pass it on to her kids, and she's going to repeat. She's going to hire local people. She's in no danger of leaving the country.
Yeah.
Her capital is safe in Duncan, and I think that as governments look to economic solutions to the pandemic, and they have to make smart economic decisions, to me, never mind the justice piece, it just makes smart economic sense.
Yeah.
There's a huge global demand for the product, and BC has a great brand, and the medical market and the rest of the world is very lucrative.
100%. 100%. So we're kind of getting to the end here. I'd love to kind of get any last final thoughts, things that maybe the regulators should hear, the farmers need to hear, the audience in broad terms needs to hear. What are some last things that we haven't talked about that you think need to have some light shined on them?
Well, I think how important it is for sectors like yourselves, like seen as being very respectable pillars of society. Everyone needs a good accountant. That's a unifier. Whether you're a police department running a healthcare facility or whatever it is, I think so. The role and the interest that your sector takes in supporting these small businesses, and I think they are small businesses, I think is really important. It's important when we go to banks and talk to them about financial services to say, look at our organization, we have a bunch of chartered accountants that are involved. It's important when we talk to investors, because when the ball does start to move for craft farmers, there's going to be a lot of money coming at this sector.
Yeah.
And the farmers are not necessarily going to know how to handle all of that. So I think that So I just wouldn't understate enough the role of your sector in the success of this industry. It's not something maybe you would have started out thinking, but it's certainly I've found is vital. The role of vendors in general, but I think particularly accountants. And I think, for accountants, it's how do you build trust then? Because then with the farmers, oh, they're just another suit. They're just
Yes, yeah.
another. They're adding to that wall of paper. I like your point about the wall of paper. They're just going to add to the wall of paper. So I think how you approach farmers, we as an organization certainly can be helpful in that regard by softening the approach and saying, look, they believe in the code of conduct. You
Hmm.
know, I think many accountants smoke weed.
Oh, probably.
So I think and we're all afraid to admit that we smoke weed. So I think if you're an accountant who smokes weed or know somebody in your family who does, tell them. Say, I condone what you're doing. I think it's great. I've seen people, I've had personal use. I've smoked weed since I was, whatever age. I think not taking your own guard down and addressing your own stigmas of the sector and it being okay to come out of the closet. And because what, accountants are cooler than people think.
You're not just
uh,
bean counters in the back. They're
yeah,
real
you're not just
people.
bean counters, you're average normal people. And I think if you're not a pot smoker, it's okay too. You should just say that and say, I don't smoke weed myself, but I know many who do, I don't know anyone does, but I'm fully supportive of this industry. I think it's the right thing to do. So I think be open about that. I think that's important. My old career before this, I was involved in broadcasting, and I was a young guy. I worked at a radio station in the prairies in Canada, and to get our broadcasting license, we had to commit to playing 3 hours of jazz music every week.
Wow.
We were like a pop station. We would play pop music during the day, so jazz was kind of the opposite. So the program director would schedule between Sunday night 9 p.m. and midnight where we would play our jazz. It's when the fewest people listen to the radio generally.
Gotcha.
And I happened to be the radio announcer on Sunday night, and I didn't know the first thing about jazz music. And he said, don't worry, the people from the local jazz society come down, they'll bring their records and they'll play them for you, and you just interview them and talk about the music. And I said, okay, well, that sounds easy. So every Sunday at 8:30, I'd wait for the jazz society person to buzz the door. I'd go down, and I noticed every week they were all accountants. All of the jazz fans were accountants. And you figure, okay, if they're jazz fans, 50-50 chance they're weed smokers too. And then a couple times I would go down and I'd be waiting, and the guy wouldn't show up. Different people would come on different weeks, and I go out and I can see the parking lot, and this happened on 2-3 occasions. The guys were out there just completely hotboxing in the car, smoking weed in their
That's
car
funny.
onto the radio show, because for them I thought it was cool.
Yeah.
And they're all accountants. So to me, that was my first real introduction to accountants. Was that they like jazz. Many of them smoked cannabis, and I felt better about accountants after that. Frankly, they were real people and they were interesting. So I think for your sector, your involvement is key, and presenting yourself just as real people
For
to the
sure.
farmers, I think, is important as well, because they can smell it a mile away. They're very smart people. I find they're very intuitive. They're common sense oriented. And I think that the approach needs to be much more soft and human, as opposed to, I'm here because you must comply.
Yeah, more of a partner instead of an
I'm
enforcer
here
of
to
the
be a partner
rules.
in your business, and I support what you do. I think that's important, is that acceptance that this is a normal industry just like any other. So I
Yeah,
think that's important. And when that validation from accounting sectors and others we've seen goes a very long way with the people who ultimately make the decisions that affect these people's lives, which is the regulators and so on, because it gives government reassurance that
yeah,
we're an organization that can be trusted.
makes sense. That's his great closing remarks and closing arguments here. Is yeah, this is a real industry. It's legitimate. The optics are look a little bit different than most people would have hoped by this deep into it. But David, thank you very much for kind of unpacking and talking about things that most people don't talk about or don't even know. My eyes have been opened up significantly. I will do a lot more boots on the ground research. But thank you very much for your time. This has been, again, an enlightening conversation. So thank you.
Thank you, Jim, and best to all your listeners, and hope you all stay safe. Keep up the great work.